Okay, today's daf is Ayin Bet 72. We are starting at the bottom of Ayin Aleph Amud Bet, very last line Amar Ula. So we're still on the topic for a little bit longer of the Korbanot, but we're going to take up a tangential point today about the Korban Asham. And we should be familiar with Ashamot because this is mentioned actually in Ezehu Mekoman Shel Zevachim, that's read in the Korbanot if people read the Korbanot in the morning. And we know that we should know then that there are three different types of situations where a person brings an asham. Well, there's asham talui, which is a totally different thing, and asham nazir is a totally different thing. But then you have three sins for which an asham is brought. So asham nazir is part of the kapara of the nazir. It's part of his atonement. And the asham talui is where a person isn't sure if they committed a sin that would require a korban chatat or not. But then you have three ashamot that are actually for specific sins. One is for asham ve'ilot, which is a person who misappropriates or benefits from the things that are consecrated to the Beit HaMikdash. Asham gezelot is where a person steals and lies under oath and then confesses that they lied. That's an asham gezelot. And then you have asham shivcha charufa, which is the asham of a person who has relations with a shivcha charufa. Shivcha charufa is there's a discussion about exactly what the parameters are. The basic way that it's understood halachically in the end is that it is that everyone agrees that it's speaking about a shivcha kena'anit. It's speaking about a slave woman, a maidservant, who is engaged or is betrothed really to an eved ivri, to a Jewish servant. So this is permitted. A Jewish slave is allowed to be married to a shivcha kena'anit. But in this case, actually, she is, according to the halachic conclusion, this shivcha kena'anit, this maidservant, is actually owned by two partners and half free, half owned. So she is halfway to freedom. So because of that, she has a quasi-independent status and a quasi maidservant status, and she's betrothed to this Eved Kena'ani. Now what happens is that since that betrothal isn't on the same level of status as a real marriage, because for example, if the Eved Ivri becomes free, he doesn't stay with the woman would stay behind with the master. She wouldn't come with him. So it isn't really the same level of marital connection that you would have in a typical marriage. So therefore the rule for violating, in other words, if she commits adultery, so the adulterer isn't held to the same standard as adultery would be held in normal circumstances, and he brings a korban asham. Now what's unique about the korban asham that he brings is that it can be brought not only if he does this inadvertently. Let's say he goes to a bar, meets this woman, he doesn't realize that I don't know what she's doing in a bar, she's supposed to be working, but she meets the maidservant and they have an affair, so he doesn't know that she's married to technically to an Eved Ivri, to a Hebrew slave, and so therefore he did it by accident. But even if he did it on purpose, even if he knew who she was, he can bring a korban asham to atone for what he did. So that it is a unique kind of thing. And a korban chatat, if you know what you're doing and you do it, you cannot come. If you fully know, and we discussed the parameters of what it means to fully know, then you can't bring a korban for that. It's over. But when it comes to a korban asham, even if you know what you did, for example, you knew you lied under oath about stealing the money, and yet you could still bring a korban asham when you confess to having done it. So Amar Ula says, Lemad Amar Asham Vadai lo baya yidia batchila. According to the person who says that Asham Vadai doesn't require knowledge beforehand. And what he means by knowledge beforehand is that even if a person were to bring an Asham Vadai and didn't realize that he had actually committed the prohibition, it could still cover for it. How do we know that? Because we have to understand that since even for something which is b'mezid, in other words, even for something which is intentionally done, this korban can be brought. So it's not a matter of being in a lapse of awareness and then coming to realize that you made a mistake. Like the korban chatat is you did something in a lapse of awareness. And now you're aware of it. So becoming aware of your mistake is what requires you to bring the korban. That can't be the case for the korban asham. Because the korban asham, you might have even known all along. You might have done it b'mezid. So awareness doesn't play the same role here that it plays in korban chatat. So there's an opinion that says that even were you to offer a korban asham without knowing that you had committed the sin, it would still cover for it because yediyah doesn't play a role. There's one view that says that yediyah, knowledge, awareness of your sin, doesn't play a role in Korban Hashem at all. So, Ba'al Chamesh Be'ilot B'Shivcha Charufa Eno Chayav Ela Achat. As we move to Ayin Bet Amud Aleph, that according to this, that knowledge and awareness doesn't play a role, even if a person were to have relations 5 times with the Shivcha Charufa, it would still just be one Korban. Because what normally divides between the mistakes? Becoming aware. You did it wrong once, you realized you made a mistake. You did it wrong again, you realized you made a mistake. You made a mistake again.
That's exactly the hole that we had yesterday. That was the part that was missing yesterday, because they talked all about
one lapse of awareness,
but they didn't talk about the essence of the awareness of whether you did it before or after.
Right. Well, yesterday we were bringing
this up, right?
Yeah. Mainly, we were talking yesterday about where you did the actions in one lapse of awareness. Actually, we had different permutations. We had some cases where you did it in one lapse of awareness, but you became aware in two epiphanies versus one. Here we're talking about a case where maybe it doesn't even matter. Awareness doesn't have any effect, because even if you did it on purpose, you would still be equally chayav. And therefore, even if you were to offer the korban without realizing what you did, it should cover for all of it. So therefore, even if you had relations 5 times with this woman, and let's say you only remembered 1 time, or let's say even in between the 5 violations, you came to realize it. In a korban chatat, if you ate a piece of chelev, and then you realized it was chelev, and you said, "Whoops, I made a mistake," and then you forgot again, and you ate it again, and then you said, "Whoops, I made a mistake," and then you forgot, "Whoops, I made a mistake." That's 3 chataot. Each whoops is a separate chatat. Here, we don't look at it that way, because it's not based on the number of mistakes that you've made and you've recovered. It's just a korban hasham is a gezerat katuv. It's a special thing that the person can bring, a korban hasham, and it can atone for this sin even when it's on purpose.
What happens if it's 2 different women?
Then it wouldn't be. That would be 2. So that's actually, the Mefarshim explain that it's only talking about if you did the exact same sin twice, more than once. But yeah, if it's 2 different women, it's a different story. Rav Hamnuna raises an objection. He says, okay, well, according to that, let's say a guy really likes this shivcha charufa, so he has 2 affairs with her, and then he separates he says, I really should stop doing this. I'd better bring a korban hasham. So he separates the korban. He says, here's my korban hasham for having relations with this betrothed woman. But he says, but before I offer it, let me go one more time and have one more night with her. But you can't do that. Right? So Amarle said, so he says, according to you, it doesn't matter, right?
It's not Korban Hashem anymore.
Yeah. According to you, it doesn't matter. Awareness, not awareness, how many times, it doesn't matter. So he might as well get more for his money. What's the problem? So he says, no, Amarle Masid, you're talking about something he did after he separated the korban. I'm not talking about what he does. Once he separates the korban, it's over. Okay, he can't add anything else. But anything he did before that, we don't care if he became aware in between violations. We don't care if he forgot some of the violations and he didn't remember them at all. And he remembers them after he brings it. That doesn't matter. But a crime committed after he separated the korban, for sure is not going to be covered by the korban once it's designated. However, anything that he did before that, even if, let's say, he only recalled 2 of the 5 times that he did it, when he separated the korban, they all happened before. So the fact that they all happened before, so they can all be included in this korban. We're not going to say after he offers the korban, and then he says, I just realized there was a 4th time and a 5th time. It doesn't matter, it's already over. But once he separated the korban, he can't go and say, wait a second, I'm going to keep the korban here. That doesn't work.
A wild, forgetful guy.
This is my brother had once my brother's a neuropsychologist, and he once had a case of a woman who came and her husband was having memory problems. And the memory problem was he kept forgetting he was married. Somehow, and the wife believed it. She kept catching him in with different neighbors, different affairs.
Oops.
And he kept saying, I forgot. So it's very. This is not forgetting, though. Yeah, but that was a true story. He must have been a very crafty guy. He convinced his wife of that. According to the view that says, actually, no, Hashem Vadai requires you to know what you did. It requires you to know. It doesn't cover if you didn't know. So, then if you had relations with the woman 5 times, you would be culpable for each time. Each time would be an independent rule. Okay? So, and Rashi says, you can see Rashi that really he says that it's not a disagreement here. They're just comparing. They're saying if you said that knowledge is necessary for an asham to be effective, then that would mean that that your awareness has an impact. Awareness has an impact, and therefore awareness can multiply the number of transgressions. So he says chayav al kol achad v'echad, and Rashi says that right now they're assuming that what he says is that when you had relations many times on purpose, that's where you only bring one korban, because there's no awareness in between. In other words, if you knew what you were doing and you did this activity 5 times, knowing what you were doing with this woman, it doesn't make sense to say, I realized it in between. But if you did it b'shogeg, you did it by accident, so therefore you could say that he had relations with this woman, he forgot what happened, later on he did it again. So these are more than one lapse of awareness will actually separate these violations into separate violations, just like the person who ate a piece of chaylev. He forgot that, he didn't realize it was chaylev, and then he realized it, and then he forgot again and ate more, and then he realized it again. It can multiply the number of sins. So depending on whether you hold that awareness and knowledge of your sin has an effect or is relevant to the korban asham, it's going to determine whether you think that you can separate these violations into multiple violations. Because it only stands to reason to separate them based on lapses of awareness if awareness and knowledge play a role. So now the Gemara says, Amar le Abaye said to him, to Rav Dimi, when it comes to a korban chatat, everybody knows that you have to be aware of your sin to bring a korban chatat, because it says onoda elav chatato. You have to know. Uplige Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, and over there we know that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rish Lakish, have a machloket about this. How so? Because we said, and as Rashi explains here on the side, he says that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagree. V'ka'amar Rish Lakish te'en yediot mechalakot le'tchayev b'shtayim al shnei zeitei chaylev ben echad. Alma lo hashiva le'chiluk yediah ke'chiluk kapara. Okay, which means to say that just because knowing in between makes more than one violation, knowing afterwards doesn't make more than one violation, right? So he says, why? Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, when you became aware of remember yesterday, so you had you ate 2 pieces of chaylev, but you only remembered the first one, and then you remembered the second one. So Rabbi Yochanan says they're now 2 separate things. Why? Because once you remembered number 1, that's like one korban was already set. And then once you remember number 2, it's like another korban is set. Reish Lakish doesn't look at it that way. He says if you remembered in between the violations, that's okay. But what order you remember them in afterwards is not going to matter. Okay, v'gabei shivcha charufa, Rashi says, b'yidiot sheben bia lebia, lav ke'avad korban chashive lechalek, v'chi echid b'mezid didei mevi achat al kulan, achanami mevi achat al kulan, v'lo damei lediot sheben achilat chelev l'achilat chelev shemachalakot l'divrei hakol. So he says that here, what are we talking about? We're talking about awarenesses in between violations. Okay, and everybody agrees when it comes to a korban chatat that awarenesses in between violations are what separate them, right? When it comes to a korban asham, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan have an argument. Their argument should be applicable here as well. Just like in the case of korban chatat, they have an argument about what is the role of awareness. Okay, everybody agrees awareness in between violations separates them. What is the awareness afterwards? What role does it play? Okay, that's where they argue, with Rabbi Yochanan saying awareness separates because the awareness is like you offered a korban. And Rish Lakish says awareness only separates in between because it makes it into 2 different mistakes. But afterwards, when the mistakes have already been made, if it was all done in one lapse of awareness, it's not 2 different mistakes. It's just 2 different awarenesses after the fact. And that's not going to divide it into 2 different mistakes. So what Rashi says is that it's not the same in the Shivcha Charufa as eating chelev. Why? Because in the Shivcha Charufa, even b'mezid, even if you did all these violations on purpose with full awareness, we would still bring the korban. So obviously we're not looking at awareness We're not looking at this from the perspective of shigagot. We're not looking at this from the perspective of how many mistakes did you make. How do we know we're not looking at it from the perspective of how many mistakes you make? Because it doesn't even have to be a mistake in the case of having relations with this woman. So we're not looking at it as in terms of how many mistakes did you make. So we could only be looking at it in terms of awareness, like the awareness after you did the action. Like the awareness about which Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are arguing. Because the awareness in between violations shouldn't be relevant according to anyone, because that awareness in between violations is only relevant when we're looking at the number of mistakes you make. But here it's not an issue of mistakes, because even intentional violation requires a korban. So what is the only question left to ask? Is becoming aware of the violations one at a time, or is becoming aware of the violations, like Rabbi Yochanan says, the equivalent to offering the korban, or to separating out the korban? And Reish Lakish says, no, it isn't equivalent. So Reish Lakish actually should say in the case of Shivcha Charufa, that for sure, even if you became aware in between your 5 violations, you should not have to bring 5 korbanot. Because that issue of how many mistakes you made is not relevant when it comes to Shivcha Charufa. But Rabbi Yochanan, who says that becoming aware is like you separated and offered the korban, like you started the process of kapara already, according to him it should make a difference. So how can you say that anybody who thinks that awareness is relevant to korban asham thinks that you should be obligated 5 for having relations 5 times? That isn't true. Reish Lakish should say that it's all consolidated into 1. And only Rabbi Yochanan should say that it's separated into 5. Because only he says that becoming aware, whether it's during the violations, in the midst of them, or afterwards, is like you started the process of kapara. But nobody here should believe that Reish Lakish's interpretation of awareness, which is relevant to Korban Chatat, where we're concerned about mistakes, should apply here. Because here we're not concerned about mistakes. We're only concerned about, did you start the kapara process for the first violation? Reish Lakish would say becoming aware doesn't mean you started the kapara process, so it's not relevant here. So it's all one violation. Rabbi Yochanan says that once you've become aware of a violation, it's like you started the kapara process for that violation, and therefore his position would divide these violations into 5.
If you remembered all 5 at one time,
or in between them,
after it was all over,
or in between them, either way, because his theory is that even in between, what's the reason why it divides between the two? Oh, because it's like you started the process already.
But why afterwards all at once?
If you remember them all at once, you mean?
Yeah,
if you remembered them, according to him, if you remembered them all at once at the end, I'm not so sure that would be the same.
Oh.
We're talking about where in between you became aware.
But you said.
But we're applying his position, because in other words, we're extrapolating. We're saying with the korban chatat, what's significant is how many mistakes you made. Okay, according to Reish Lakish. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's how many times you became aware. Because each time you became aware of a violation, whether in the midst of violating or afterwards, each becoming aware actually is like you started the kapara process. So if you became aware of both of them simultaneously.
Right.
So then it's like you started one kapara process for both.
So then, according to Rabbi Yochanan, say our wild guy remembers afterwards, oh, I did this 5 times.
So that would be 1. That would be 1 even according to him. Because the awareness is 1 time. So, that's his theory. So they're saying, according to this, we have to factor out Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is not going to say that you can subdivide these violations with this woman, because we're not concerned about shagagot here. We're not concerned about mistakes, because even if you did it on purpose, you still bring the korban. But Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the number of korbanot, the division, the fact that awareness divides your violation into multiple violations, isn't because of mistakes. It's because each time you become aware, you started the process of kapara for that violation. So his position should be just as relevant here. It doesn't matter that you did it on purpose or you did it by accident. What matters is that you started the process of atoning for violation number 1 when you remembered it, and you started the process for number 2 when you remembered that. Okay, so that's the way he's going to think about it. And ishtik. So he was silent. In other words, Rav Hamnuna felt like he didn't know what to answer. Rav Dimi didn't know what to answer the question that was raised to him by Abaye. He didn't know what to say. So then he says, he answers for him. Amar lei. So Abaye suggests an answer. Dilma b'maaseh de la'achar hafrasha ka'amrat ukid Rav Hamnuna. Maybe what you had in mind was, because he shocked him, because basically Rav Dimi comes and says, oh, if you say that awareness plays any role in a Korban Asham, then that means that if you did it 5 times and you were aware in between each violation, you're going to bring 5 Korbanot. Abaye says that's not true according to Reish Lakish. That's only true according to Rabbi Yochanan. Because only Rabbi Yochanan holds that awareness is so powerful that it could subdivide in that case. And he says, and he didn't know what to say. So Abaye says, maybe what you were thinking was that if you had 5 violations, and in between each violation, he actually separated a korban, and then did the second violation. And he separated a korban, and then he did another violation. In other words, violations that come after the separation of a korban, like Rav Hamnuna said before, that you can't separate the korban and then say, oh, now I hold on to this korban for a second, I'll be right back. You can't do that. So maybe that's the case where you have 5 violations. But in a case where you didn't separate the korban and designate it, then you wouldn't have a multiplicity of violations, at least not according to Reish Lakish, that's for sure.
So when they say korban, are you talking about the same korban? I mean, you bring the same korban, whether it's b'mezid or...
You bring the same korban, but how many you bring is the issue here. But yeah, it's the same korban.
It's the same korban. I see.
Yeah. So he says Amar le'in. He says, yeah, that must be it. That must be what the teaching was that I had. That if it's done in between, in other words, according to Rabbi Yochanan, just becoming aware of the violations is like you started the kapara process. But according to Reish Lakish, we only would consider it that you started the process if you actually separated the korban and you had it designated. And that must be the case where everybody would agree that you can separate these and subdivide these violations into more than one. Ki ata Ravin Amar, when Ravin came, he said, Hakol modim b'shivcha charufa, v'akol modim b'shivcha charufa, u'machloket b'shivcha charufa. Okay, so what does that mean? Everybody agrees about this betrothed woman. Everybody agrees about the betrothed woman, and there's a machloket about the betrothed woman. So what is he talking about? It was a riddle. So now you have to, if you can solve the riddle, then the secret passageway will open for you as well. What's the riddle? So Hakol modim b'shivcha charufa de'ino chayav ela achat kedu'ula. Everybody agrees with the shivcha charufa that you're only obligated in one in accordance with ula. In other words, everybody agrees that if you don't factor awareness in at all, it has no relevance at all. Even if you brought the Korban Hashem and you didn't even realize your violations, you could still cover it. Then everyone agrees that also means that multiple violations are going to be subsumed under one heading. So that would mean even according to the view that awareness is irrelevant to Korban Hashem, then even according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you had relations with a woman and you realized it, and you had relations with a woman and you realized it, it would still all be one thing, because awareness is irrelevant completely to Korban Asham, and everybody agrees with that position of Ula. And everybody agrees that if you separated the Korban already, like Rav Hamnuna said, and you designated it, you can't now say, wait, I want to get the most for my money, so since I'm offering it anyway, I might as well go back one more time. You can't do that. That would be a new violation. Everybody agrees with that. Everyone agrees with that. And umachloket b'shivcha charufa. And there's a machloket regarding shivcha charufa. Leman damar Hashem vadai ba'ei yediya batchila. Machloket Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. That you would have, according to the view. In other words, everybody agrees that there's a machloket. Right? That according to the view that awareness does play a role, that you do have to be aware of what you did, that there's going to be a machloket between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Because according to Reish Lakish, becoming aware in between violations is only significant in a korban chatat, because there we're numbering the amount of mistakes you made. But here, mistakes are irrelevant. According to Rabbi Yochanan, awareness subdivides the violation into more than one violation, not because we're counting the number of mistakes you made, in which case it would be irrelevant to Asham, where even b'mezid, even on purpose, is counted. But rather, the reason why Rabbi Yochanan says that it subdivides is because each time you become aware, it's like you started the process of kapara, of atonement for that. It's as if you had separated the korban and you're ready to offer it. So therefore he would say that his principle is going to be just as relevant to Korban Asham if we assume that becoming aware is part of Korban Asham, because that means that becoming aware is the first step in the process of kapara, and that would mean that according to Rabbi Yochanan, indeed, it would subdivide your violation. So now we get on to another topic for a moment. Itmar, it was stated as we turn to Amud Bet, nitkaven lahagbia et hatalush v'chatach et hamechubar patur, lachtoch et hatalush v'chatach et hamechubar. So now everybody agrees on the first case, that if you saw, let's say, a cucumber on the ground, or you saw a potato, and you thought that it was actually disconnected from the ground. Okay, so he says I'm sorry, not that you saw the cucumber was disconnected, that there was a knife on the ground, and you went to pick up the knife off of the ground, which was obviously talush, it's not connected to the ground. And as you were picking it up, as you were picking the knife up, you cut the cucumber out of the ground. So that's obviously a violation of Shabbat. But what was your intention? You didn't intend to cut the vegetable at all. All you intended to do was pick up your knife. And it happened to be that in picking up your knife, you accidentally severed the connection between this item and the ground, which is the same as kitzirah, it's the same as harvesting. So everyone agrees that in that case, no problem. But what about this case? That lachtoch et talush, you went to cut a cucumber that you thought was actually not planted in the ground, but accidentally, b'chatach et mechubar, you cut something that was connected to the ground. So what did you do? You ended up harvesting by accident. You intended to cut the item, in this case. You didn't just intend to pick up your knife. You intended to cut the item, but you didn't intend to cut an item that was attached to the ground. So cutting was intended. So in the first case, the action wasn't even intended that you ended up doing, because you weren't even thinking of cutting, let alone cutting something connected to the ground. In the second, that everybody agrees is patur. It's called mitasek. You weren't even doing, it's not even considered by accident, because you didn't even mean to do the action. By accident means you consciously intended to do the action, but you didn't realize it was prohibited. Not that you didn't even consciously intend to do the action. If you're picking up the knife, you didn't even consciously intend to cut anything. So it's called mitasek. But if you went to cut something, it's just that you didn't realize that what you were cutting was a cucumber that's connected to the ground. You thought it was something that was detached from the ground. Here you have a safek. Now, what is the classic case of shogeg, by the way? The classic case of bishogeg is, I know that this potato was attached to the ground, but I didn't remember it was Shabbat. Or I know that this potato was attached to the ground, but I didn't realize you can't detach a potato from the ground on Shabbat. That, everyone agrees, is bishogeg. But what happens if a person didn't know that the potato was attached to the ground? He knew that it was Shabbat. He knew that you can't detach a potato from the ground, but he didn't realize that potato was attached to the ground. That's the case we're talking about here. So Rava Amar Patur. Rava says he's Patur. That is not bishogeg. When it comes to Hilchot Shabbat, that's also mitasek. You didn't know that it was attached to the ground. And bishogeg is only when you knew what you were doing completely. You just didn't realize it was prohibited. Or you didn't realize that it had karet, in the case like we said before. And then, but Abaye Amar Chayav. Abaye says, not knowing it was attached to the ground is still bishogeg. So Chayav, it doesn't mean Chayav that you would get the death penalty, because we're talking, somebody made a mistake here. We mean it would bring a Korban Chatat. Korban Chatat, because you violated Shabbat bishogeg. In other words, Rava is saying that's not even an accidental violation, it's a nothing. Rava Amar Patur Dahalo Nitkaven Lachati Chati Isura. Rava says that the cutting that you did, that you're patur, you are exempt from what you did, because you didn't intend to cut something that was attached to the ground. You intended to cut something that was detached from the ground. Okay, and in order to be bishogeg on Shabbat, you have to know what you're doing. What you're doing, you have to know. You just didn't know that it was prohibited. Either because you forgot it was Shabbat or you forgot it was prohibited. Abaye Amar Chayav Kamechaven Lachaticha Be'alma. Abaye says, as long as mechanically you knew that you were cutting something, okay, that's considered bishogeg. You didn't know that it was attached to the ground, fine. But you knew you were cutting something. It's not like the action you did wasn't intended. The action you did was intended, you just didn't realize the full picture. But you meant to cut the vegetable. It's not like you dropped the knife and it cut the vegetable. That's mitasek. Or you picked up a knife and you accidentally cut the vegetable. That's called mitasek. It wasn't even on your radar to cut this vegetable. But cutting the vegetable and not realizing it was attached to the ground, Abaye is going to say that's the same as taking something out of the ground when you didn't realize that was prohibited on Shabbat. Or it's the same as forgetting it was Shabbat and plucking it out of the ground. You forgot, you were unaware of part of the picture, and that's what caused you to do the Averah. So he says it's the same thing. You were unaware it was attached to the ground. So Amar Rava says, Mina Aminala, where do I get my idea that unless you were aware that it was attached to the ground and forgot it was Shabbat or forgot it was prohibited to harvest, that you are not culpable? In other words, if you didn't realize it was attached to the ground, even though you cut it on purpose. Titania, as it says in the Braita, Chomer Shabbat mishar mitzvot, v'chomer shar mitzvot mishabbat. There is a stringency with regard to Shabbat that doesn't apply to other mitzvot, and vice versa. Chomer Shabbat mishar mitzvot. What is it about Shabbat that's more stringent than other mitzvot? Shah Shabbat. That when it comes to Shabbat, if you did two violations of Shabbat in one lapse of awareness, you are culpable for both. And of course, that would only be in a case where you did two different melachot. You remembered it was Shabbat, but you forgot two different melachot, and you did two different melachot on Shabbat. That's the only time you would have more than one violation. Masha'en ken b'shar mitzvot, which is not true about other mitzvot. Like, for example, as the Gemara is going to say, I'll leave it for the Gemara to explain. V'chomer she'ar mitzvot mishabat, she'b'shar mitzvot shagag b'lo mitkaven chayav, masha'en ken b'shabat. So the Braita says that with regard to other mitzvot, if you made a mistake b'lo mitkaven, without intending what you were doing, you are culpable. In other words, if you didn't realize that piece of chaylev was a piece of chaylev and you ate it, you're culpable. Whereas Rava is saying, it says Masha'en ken b'Shabbat, which is not true on Shabbat. You thought that vegetable was disconnected from the ground, so you cut it. That's not considered b'shogeg. You had to have known it was connected to the ground and forgotten that it was prohibited for one reason or another. That's what Rava says. And he says that that's what you see, because it says that when it comes to other mitzvot, shagag belo mitkaven, if he made a mistake belo mitkaven and didn't intend what he was actually doing, he's exempt. Which is not true about other mitzvot. We're going to see now. Now the Gemara is going to explain this whole thing. So, Amar, the Master said, Chomer Shabbat mishar mitzvot, Shabbat asa shetayim be'elam echad, chayav al kol achad v'echad, mashen ken b'shar mitzvot. So what does it mean that when it comes to Shabbat, if you did two violations, you're culpable for both, which is not true about other mitzvot? Hey chidame, what are we talking about here? Wait a second. What is the only case on Shabbat where you're going to be culpable for two violations? That's going to be when you did two different melachot. You did reaping and you did harvesting. You did harvesting and you did grinding, and you didn't realize that harvesting was prohibited, and you didn't realize grinding was prohibited. You forgot. So what's the analogous case in other mitzvot? That you ate forbidden fat and you ate blood. Two different things. But tarte mechayev. Hacha tarte mechayev, hacha tarte mechayev. That wouldn't be a difference, that would be the same. If you ate dam, you ate blood, and you ate forbidden fat, that's two different things. If you reaped and you ground flour, that's two different things. So they would be the same. That's not a stringency by Shabbat relative to other mitzvot. Ela shar mitzvot lo mechayev ela chada hechidame. So what is the case where you only have one culpability for multiple violations in ordinary mitzvot, dachal chelev v'chelev, which is where you eat forbidden fat twice. You ate it once, and then you ate it again in the same lapse of awareness. You ate two kezetim, that would be one violation. Dekavataga be Shabbat. So what's the analogous case? That you did two actions of harvesting in Shabbat. That would be the analogous case. But again, it would be the same. In other words, the case that you construct for Shabbat, where you're obligated in two korbanot, which is where you do two different melachot, would be analogous to the case where you have two different forbidden foods. And in both cases, it would be the same result, that you would have to bring two korbanot. And the case on Shabbat, where you would bring only one korban for two violations, which is where you did the same thing twice in the same spell of a lack of awareness, if you did that with, if we make an analogous case to other mitzvot, eating chelev twice, again, it would be the same result, one korban. So where is the difference here? Rather, we must say that since it's talking about being culpable for two, it's talking about where you did harvesting and you did grinding. What is the case of other mitzvot where it would not make you culpable for two? avodah zarah. It's talking about idolatry. Ukid Rabbi Ami, like Rabbi Ami said, Amar Rabbi Ami, zibeach v'kiter v'nisech v'halama achat. If a person offered a sacrifice and burned incense and poured a libation in one lack of awareness to an idol, eino chayav ela achat. He only has to bring one korban chatat. That's obviously a very severe violation, or avodah zarah. He did it by accident. He didn't realize it was an idolatrous temple, and he did it. Okay, or whatever. Or he forgot that you weren't allowed to do idolatry, which would be hard to imagine, but let's say he did. So the point is, though, that all these different forms of violation are subsumed under one, even though they're different forms. There's offering of a korban to the idolatry, there's burning of incense, there is, and there's pouring of libation, and yet it's all one. They're all subsumed under one korban chatat. Whereas if on Shabbat you violated Shabbat in 3 different ways, you harvested, you cooked, and you ground flour. So it would be 3. So that's where there's a difference between Shabbat and Avodah Zarah. B'mai okimta. So what is the okimta here? What are you telling me is the case by Avodah Zarah? We're talking about Avodah Zarah. So emasefa. What about the end of the Braita? Chomer b'shar mitzvot sheb'shar mitzvot shagag b'lo mitkaven chayav masha'en ken b'Shabbat. Because at the end of the Braita it said that there's a stringency. Okay, just like there's a stringency with Shabbat. That if you did multiple melachot on a Shabbat, you have to bring for every melacha that you forgot. Assuming that you remembered it was Shabbat and you forgot the melachot. Which is not true about idolatry. If you forgot that that idolatry was prohibited and you did 3 different forms, you only have to bring 1 korban. But let's reverse it. You said that there's a case of other mitzvot that's more stringent than Shabbat. That in other mitzvot, if you made a mistake below mitkaven and it wasn't intended, that you are held responsible, whereas on Shabbat you're not held responsible. So what is the case where you are shagag v'lo mitkaven? Hay shagag v'lo mitkaven v'lo mitkaven da avodah zarah hechidameh. What is the case of you made a mistake and it wasn't intentional with regard to idolatry? Where do we find such a thing? Let's say you had a case where you thought that it was a bet knesset, you didn't realize it was a shrine of idolatry, and you bowed down towards it. So that's not idolatry. You didn't mean to. It wasn't idolatry. You didn't mean to worship idols. Rather, it means you saw a statue and you bowed to the statue. Okay, so
They had in Europe, they had these churches where the very low entrance.
Yeah, they have that in Israel.
I see how beautiful it is, and then he goes and bows.
Well, they have that in Israel too. They have that in Israel too. There's that church in Israel.
So they have a Slav there, and so you bow down to the Slav.
Yeah, isn't that in Israel? Yeah, they want you to have to bow when you come in. Right. So there you go. So and Rashi says that even if you bowed towards a house of idolatry, even if you knew that it was a shrine of idolatry, if you bow but you don't mean to actually worship the idolatry, you wouldn't be culpable for that anyway.
Slav is like a vessel?
Yeah, you would think, well, it depends. I mean, if they bow to it, yeah. So if you saw a statue and you bowed to it, so what case are we talking about? If you're accepting it as a god, mezidu, then you're doing it on purpose. And if you didn't, then it's nothing. In other words, the point is that idolatry is very much a matter of the heart. It's different than Shabbat in that sense. Because, I mean, if you bowed to something but you really didn't mean it, then nobody's going to say that you actually worshipped it, because you didn't mean to worship it. You just happened to bow when it was there. Now, when it comes to the issue of doing that, if somebody tries to force you to, so then the question becomes, okay, well, what if somebody tries to force you to bow to the idol, and they're going to kill you, and you have to give up your life? Why should I have to give up my life if I bow to it, and I think in my mind that I don't really believe in it, I'm not doing idolatry? The answer is that there you're dealing with Chilul Hashem, you're dealing with perception. Okay? Here we're talking about for the individual. For the individual, it's not idolatry unless he means it. So then, Ella me'ava miyira. Maybe we're talking about the person who loves his girlfriend so much that he wants to bow down to this idol that she likes. She really likes an idol. He doesn't believe in it, but he's going to worship it and participate in worship because he's doing it out of love. He's not really out of emunah, but he means to do it. He means to worship the idol, but he's worshiping it because he wants to win favor with his girlfriend, or because he's afraid of pressure, like the people who would convert because they were going to lose their job or something like that. So the person isn't doing it because they want to, but they're really doing it. So Anichala Abaye Damar Chayav. That makes sense according to Abaye, who says that one who accepts idolatry out of Ahava v'yirah, fear or love of another person, is considered to be culpable for idolatry. Okay, and that's why it says Shagag Belo Mitkaven, that if you did that, you're culpable. Whereas on Shabbat, Shagag Belo Mitkaven, where you don't know what you're doing, In other words, you don't intend what you're doing on Shabbat, you would be exempt. But in idolatry, even though you don't intend what you're doing, there's a stringency that you're still held responsible, even though you don't intend it, because you are doing it. So Ella le Rava da Amar Patur, but what about Rava who says that if you bow down to an idol and it's out of love or fear of a person, that you're actually exempt? So Ika lememar, so my Ika lememar, what are we going to say? Ella beomer mutar, masha'engin b'Shabbat de patur legamre. So there we go. So now the Gemara says that the answer is that you thought it was allowed. In other words, in a case where all of these cases where you really intended to do idolatry, but you did it for someone else, you did it for love, you did it for fear, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about be'omer mutar. The person said, I don't think that there's anything prohibited about bowing to an idol. He said, I'm going to bow. That's shagag belo mitkaven. He didn't intend it, he didn't know, and he bowed to it. So in idolatry, what are we going to say about somebody who says omer mutar? We're going to say, you're still culpable, at least for having done it by accident. You're going to have to bring a korban chatat. If you didn't know, you can't bow to an idol. In other words, it's just talking about stam. The person went and he bowed to the idol, thinking, there's nothing wrong with bowing to Jesus, We're pluralistic. And then somebody says, that's not optional. You can't bow to idols. He says, I didn't know. So then he brings a korban. Whereas on Shabbat, be'omer mutar, the Gemara is saying now, the Gemara is saying now that if he thought it was permitted, in other words, he didn't think it was Shabbat, that he's completely exempt. Well, wait a second, is that true? That if you didn't think it was Shabbat, you're completely exempt? We should all know that isn't true. But wait a second. Ad kan lo ba'aminei Rav Amirav Nachman ela ilichiyuvei chada ilichiyuvei tarte aval mipatre legamre lo. What are you talking about? Remember when Rava asked Rav Nachman before, if a person didn't know that it was Shabbat, and he didn't know the melachot, both of them, he forgot that it was Shabbat and he forgot about melachot, that person, should he be obligated for each melacha that he did, or should he be obligated just for the fundamental one that he didn't know it was Shabbat? And we concluded that the fact that he didn't know it was Shabbat is the more fundamental one. So one korban will take care of everything. But nobody ever said that he should be completely exempt. If he didn't know that it was Shabbat at all, he shouldn't be completely exempt. He should at least have to bring one korban. And you're telling me that what is our case here? That with idolatry, if you thought it was okay and you bowed to it because you thought it was okay, you're going to be obligated in a korban. But with Shabbat, if you thought it was okay, you're not going to be obligated. That's not true. If you thought it was okay, you're still going to have at least one chiyuv. So we'll move to Ayin Gimel, the beginning, just to finish off the piece. Rather, the first case, where we saw that there was a stringency with regard to Shabbat relative to other mitzvot, that's only when you compare Shabbat to idolatry. That Shabbat has the rule that if you did multiple forms of violation, you're only chayav one. I mean you're chayav for each one, rather. And idolatry, if you did multiple forms of violation, you're only chayav one. V'seifa b'shar mitzvot. But at the end, when it says that other mitzvot are more stringent than Shabbat, it's not talking about idolatry anymore, because there's no way to work out idolatry, shagag belo mitkaven, that you made a mistake and you did it without intention. And it's going to end up being stricter than Shabbat. Rather, v'shagag belo mitkaven b'shar mitzvot hechidame. So what is the case of making a mistake and being unaware in other mitzvot? Desavur deshumanhu v'achalo mash'enkin b'shabbat patur denitkaven lachtoch et talush v'chatach et mechubar patur. This is how Rava ends his argument. Basically, Rava says, what is the case where in other mitzvot you would be culpable, but in Shabbat you wouldn't be culpable? When you see a piece of fat on the plate, and you say, that looks like wonderful fat, I'm going to eat that. And you thought it was kosher fat, and it turns out it was chelev. You're still culpable. Masha'en ken b'Shabbat, which is not true on Shabbat. That if you thought that vegetable was detached from the ground, and you cut it, you're not going to be chayav to bring a korban. Meaning it's not even going to be b'shogeg. And that's how Rava concludes his point. He says, you see that it's saying in other mitzvot, shagag belo mitkaven, if you made a mistake, you're still liable, and not on Shabbat. And what's the case where you made a mistake and you're still liable? It's the case where you thought that a piece of food was kosher and it was really non-kosher. And the analogous case in Shabbat is you thought that cucumber was detached from the ground and it's really attached. And Rava says, you see, look, it's saying that it's more lenient on Shabbat. That's not considered even b'shogeg. Va'abaye, what will Abaye do with this braita? He's not going to go down so quickly. He's not going to sit down and let you do this to him. What's he going to say? Shagag b'lo mitkaven hechidame. I'm going to take it a level lower. This savur roku ubla'o ma she'en ken b'shabbat patur nitkaven la'agbi'a et hatalush v'chatach et ha'mechubar patur aval nitkaven lachtok et hatalush v'chatach et ha'mechubar chayav. He says, I disagree with you. I still think that the case you are describing, where the person thought that the cucumber was detached and it was really attached, that's still going to be a case of bishogeg. What's the only case where it's mitasek, where you're really off the hook? Where all you intended to do is pick up the knife. You didn't intend to cut that vegetable at all. And what's the analogous case? Where you saw something and you didn't even think it was fat at all. You thought it was saliva and you swallowed it. Why would you swallow saliva? I guess you thought it was your own. And you swallowed it. Right. So that case that's the only case where we're more lenient. In other words, what he's saying is, where can we find a case that it's more lenient on Shabbat than it is in other mitzvot? Not the case where you thought that the piece of fat was shuman and it was really chaylev. Because the analogous case on Shabbat, you'd also be considered to have done it at least bishogeg, at least by accident, where you'd have to bring a korban, where you thought that the cucumber was detached and it was really attached. That's what Abaye is saying. What's the only case where in other mitzvot it would be more stringent than it would be on Shabbat, where you thought that it was just liquid, you thought it was water, whatever, and it was really chaylev? Okay, you thought it was saliva and it was really chaylev. Similarly on Shabbat, you meant to pick up a knife and you cut a vegetable. In other words, you didn't even intend to eat fat, and it turned out that you did. In other mitzvot, you would still be liable, because you still consumed the chaylev. Whereas on Shabbat, if you didn't even intend to cut a vegetable, and you accidentally cut it, that would be so low on the level of kavanah that you wouldn't even require a korban chatat. It's called mitasek. You wouldn't even be considered to be violating Shabbat by accident. So he lowers the level, he lowers the bar one step and says that it has to be a case not where you didn't know the facts and you thought that this fat was really kosher fat, or you thought that this vegetable was really detached from the ground. That, he says, is still enough of an awareness, because you intended to eat fat. You intended to cut a vegetable, that you know what you're doing. What is the case where there's a differential between the two? Where you thought you were just putting saliva in your mouth, or you thought you were just picking up a knife. You didn't mean to cut something at all. You didn't mean to eat fat at all. In that case, still, in other mitzvot, the fact that you consumed the prohibited food means you have to bring a korban. But in Shabbat, since you didn't intend to cut the vegetable at all, Abaye is going to say that you are mitasek and you don't have to even bring a korban for having done that. So that's where the machloket is between Abaye and everyone agrees that when you pick up the knife, it's no problem. You're not considered to have violated it. But when you cut that vegetable, that's where the machloket is going to be. When you purposely cut the vegetable but you didn't know it was attached, that's where you find the machloket between Abaye and Rava.